His eyebrows twitched. Jinchi looked at the message but remained expressionless as he entered his office. Send a damage assessment immediately, he instructed. Sir, the official said, and went out again. Jinchi trusted that a messenger would be sent if there was anything new to report. Finally, he sighed. So it has come. The paper read simply, there has been a plague of locusts. There had been reports of small insect swarms. However, while Jinchi had seen the memos, the matters hadn't been substantial enough to warrant his personal involvement. He had been obliged to let his subordinates handle them. None of the other outbreaks had been too large, but this one was different. Jinchi reflected on the news. We are going to lose 30% of the harvest. That was a major blow. He pricked up his ears when he heard the location of the outbreak. It was to the west, a major grain-producing area. Isn't it a bit late for the wheat harvest? He asked. It is not the wheat that has been hit, it is the rice, answered Sei, Jinchi's go-loving bureaucrat. Other than his timid streak, the man was proving quite capable. For about 20 years now, they have been experimenting with growing rice in the area using large-scale irrigation. From one perspective, this could be considered fortunate. Only the areas with unharvested rice were affected. We were lucky this did not overlap with the wheat harvest. Are they drawing water from the Great River? 20 years ago was about the time Jinchi had been born. He did recall hearing about a major flood control project that had taken place around that time. They must have built something to divert the water at the same time. Yes, sir. It was purely a local endeavor, something they tried out in a couple of places. The rice harvest is more reliable than wheat. However, if the scale became too grand, it would impact everything downstream. As such, the project never got any larger than it already is. 20 years ago, that would have been the time of the Empress regnant. She was a woman among women, not afraid to experiment with even the most outlandish policies. Sei drew a large circle on a map. Jinchi observed that it wasn't too close to the capital. It also wasn't very far away. A round trip would likely take 4 or 5 days. The paperwork still formed a mountain on his desk. He looked at Basin first. Basin had remained silent during the conversation. Then he looked at Sei, who was obviously nervous. He did not want to create more work for himself or for either of them, but he just could not leave something alone when it held his attention like this. He stifled a groan. If I may, Sei raised a hand hesitantly. Yes, said Jinchi, trying his best to maintain a neutral expression. I wouldn't wish to be impertinent, Moon Prince, but is it possible you've taken on a bit too much work? It is possible, and I'm well aware of it. But what exactly am I supposed to do about this? These matters can hardly be left to anyone else. Sei blanched slightly. I hardly dare to say this, sir, but his eyes seem to look everywhere except Jinchi's face. Other honourable personages have been known to entrust their subordinates with what Basin demanded, slamming his fist down on the table. What injustice do you speak of? Sei yelped and cowered. Who would have the audacity to do such a thing? Speak up, you must know something. Basin closed in on Sei, but Jinchi held him back. Basin, you are scaring him. I would, however, be interested in the answer to his question. Who is doing such things? Grand Commandant Kan, sir. It would certainly be plausible for the honoured strategist to engage in such behaviour. However, the look on Sei's face said he was hiding something. Jinchin leaned in. May I assume he is not the only one? Sei's cheeks flushed. Jinchi had been under the impression that he had managed to avoid picking any personnel with those tendencies. It looked like he was going to have to rethink putting his face too close to Sei's. Jinchi brushed the scar on his cheek. He also spoke of His Majesty the Emperor. Jinchi and Basin were both struck dumb. Is that good enough? Sei said, looking studiously at the ground. He was obviously desperate for them both to leave him alone. Basin wasn't finished, though. Who in the world could fill in for His Majesty himself? He pressed toward Sei again, his breath hot in his nostrils. Master Gaoshan does it. Again the other two men had no recourse but silence. Of course, His Majesty puts his own seal on the documents when they're ready. I just thought that if you had an intermediary, someone to clean and organize things, they might cut down the number of memorandums that actually reached you, Moon Prince, by 2/3. If they were given the proper job title, surely they could exercise some personal discretion. Jinchi's heart skipped a beat at the suggestion that he might have only a third as much work to do. Important tasks like these could not be entrusted to just any bureaucrat, someone he might not even know. Jinchi looked at Basin. He briefly considered whether Gaeshun could handle such a job, perhaps his son could as well. Unfortunately, Basin was not really suited for desk duty. He was a diligent worker, but knowing his stern mind and inflexibility, Jinchi suspected the jobs would simply back up. He wondered if it was greedy to wish for someone with both loyalty and a good family background to handle his work, someone who was also capable and judicious. Master Jinchi, Basin said, "Yes, I do know someone particularly gifted at this kind of work." Jinchi's eyes widened. "Do you? I hadn't realized you had any acquaintances among the civil officials." "Just one, sir. Someone who passed the civil service exam last year, but presently languishes without an appointment." Jinchi realized he had an idea who Basin was referring to. "You do mean yes, sir. Baryu. Perhaps you would know him better as elder brother Ryu." As his name implied, he too was a member of the Ma clan. He was Basin's older brother. Chapter 4. The Ma siblings. Baryu was Gaeshun's son and Basin's older brother. The Ma clan produced many members with a military inclination. However, Baryu's talents ran more toward the literary and bureaucratic fields. As the eldest son, he should have been Jinchi's attendant, not Basin. However, Gaeshun knew his offspring well and did not want to burden him. Instead of making him practice swordsmanship, Gaeshun gave him a book. Baryu was not physically strong. He resembled a limp bean sprout. However, he excelled at academic studies, finding them very natural. Last year he took the civil service examination. This exam was held only once every 4 years. He passed it on his first attempt. Even the most experienced observer could see that Baryu had all the qualities of a superb civil servant. However, he was unable to find a job. What was the reason? A quick look at his current situation explained a great deal. "Impressive, as I knew he would be," Jinchi said. The stacks of papers on his desk were now low enough to see across. He sighed with relief and looked at a man working quietly in the corner of the room. His corner was not visible from the entrance. He had also placed a partitioning screen between himself and the room. This ensured visitors would not know anyone was there. To be quite frank, the man might have preferred to build 4 solid walls around himself. However, Basin had discouraged that idea. "And who was behind this screen doing all that work?" "Master Jinchi," said a man bearing an armload of paperwork. He was very slim, of average height, and his skin was so pale it bordered on sickly. He did not exactly look healthy, but it was oddly amusing to see how his face, and only his face, looked so much like Basin, the picture of physical fitness, who was standing beside him. This man was perhaps a good son shorter than Basin. The way he stooped made him look even shorter. If Basin hadn't had such a baby face, it would have been hard to tell which of them was the older brother. It would have been hard to tell which was the younger. But the stooped, feeble-looking man was indeed the older brother. He was older by only a year. Gaeshun had another son named Baryu. The Ma clan often produced soldiers, as we have noted. Members of the Ma clan were typically bodyguards for the imperial family. Gaeshun served the emperor in this role, and Basin served Jinchi. Therefore, Baryu should have been the one to act as Jinchi's attendant. He was Gaeshun's second child and oldest son. However, this rather small man wasn't suited for guard work. Baryu received the Bar name, the same character as Ma, reflecting the clan. Basin, born the next year, also received the Bar name, quick work. "You're finished already?" Jinchi said. "I am, sir. With you as a statue, the work is done. I'm afraid I don't quite follow." Baryu's explanation seemed elliptical at best. It was a jump somewhere in his train of thought, and Jinchi didn't understand what he meant. Thankfully, another person appeared at that moment. She was a tall and beautiful woman with a hard look in her eyes. For a moment, even Jinchi wasn't sure where she had come from. Baryu winced at her appearance. She said, "What Baryu is saying is this. You are as beautiful as a sculpted statue, Master Jinchi. It is hard to think of you as a human being. Even I, who am often uncomfortable around humans, can think of you as a creature that is not quite human. This allows me to focus on my work." Jinchi was quiet for a moment, unsure how to take that. He was being treated as if he were not human, quite casually. But then again, Baryu had always been this way. The beautiful woman with the cruel eyes who interpreted for Baryu and Basin was their older sister. Her name was Maomao, and she had 2 children of her own. Basin and Baryu looked like their father Gaoshan. However, Maomao took after her mother, who had been Jinchi's wet nurse. Because of this, Jinchi still found Maomao somewhat intimidating. She resembled her mother in more than just appearance. She had also inherited her strong will, and Jinchi was told that Maomao quite dominated her husband. Until a few years before, she had regarded her father Gaoshan with all the affection she would feel for a hairy caterpillar. She claimed that at some point she had upgraded him to a moth. She was also the only person Jinchi knew who could wrangle the otherwise difficult-to-handle Baryu. He did very well on the civil service exam, but he quit his job because of both his health and his unusual ideas. Because he wasn't very good at making new friends, people quickly began to resent him, almost before he realized it. His colleagues and superiors disliked him before they had a chance to get to know him. This ended up giving him a stomach ailment. Talent Baryu had talent in spades, but his personality made things difficult. He was similar to the members of the La clan in that way. However, they usually combined their individual quirks with a strong spirit that often left others feeling unsettled. Their brazen approach to life was enough to make a person jealous. If only Baryu could have half the La clan's disregard for what people thought, or even 1/10 of it. Basin sighed and put the finished work on Jinchi's desk. Jinchi started to review what Baryu had done, but one of the papers made him stop and frown. It was a circular that Jinchi himself had sent for approval to a series of other departments. Once again it had been rejected as unfeasible. How many times was this now? He said, so they really won't do it. Basin asked, rejected again, sir. He replied, it's the timing. If it were for next year they would approve it. Basin said, the martial service exams are next year, aren't they? He answered, yes. Someone thinks we should wait for those. What was Jinchi's idea that was failing to get approved? It was to expand the military. He wanted more troops stationed in the north, but the proposal had been rejected. The martial service exams were essentially the soldiers' equivalent of the civil service test. Attendance at these events wasn't as high as the bureaucrats predicted, but they would still attract many strong young men. These men would make excellent officers. The military had been shrinking for a few years, and there were 2 reasons for this change. The first reason was a simple lack of wars. The second reason was a matter of personnel. Specifically, the 2 people who stood at the top of the military hierarchy were Grand Commandant Khan and Grand Marshal Lo. Basin said this. The Grand Marshal was the highest-ranking civil official involved in military matters. The Grand Commandant, for his part, was considered one of the Sangong. These were the 3 most important leaders of the country. Like the Grand Marshal, his was a military role. I must wonder how Grand Commandant can attain that title, Basin said. Jinchi would have liked to know the same thing. However, all he had to go on were some unsettling rumors. Some people said that after Lakan eliminated those who opposed him, there were no other high-ranking officials available for the post. Others believed he was favored by the former emperor's mother, the Empress Regnant. They said she guaranteed his swift rise in the world. Some people believed that after becoming emperor, the current ruler tasked Lakan with watching over any relatives who might want to be emperor themselves. To be honest, I'm not sure, Jinchi said. He thought he knew, or at least could guess, why the man had wanted so much power. Maomao had spoken of it once, and she was openly disgusted while doing so. She said that he could not obtain something without having power. Lakan was a man who would do anything to get what he desired, but there were not many things he actually wanted. He was not the kind to let his greed multiply endlessly. Jinchi grumbled, a military man ought to want a little more. It was easy to understand someone who would use any pretext to have more pawns at their disposal. It was also easy to work with them. But if Lakan had his board games, his family, and a sweet treat to enjoy, then he was satisfied. He wanted very little out of life, but he was irrepressible in action. That is what made him such a thorn in the side of those around him. Perhaps if you were to try speaking directly with Grand Commandant Khan, Basin suggested. Jinchi said that would cause more problems than it solved. Lakan did not like him very much, and there were obvious reasons for this. He would sometimes drop by Jinchi's office and waste his time. He would eat a snack and make a mess of the paperwork. Jinchi hadn't seen him around here much lately, and he knew why. Lakan was busy spending time at the medical office. He could easily imagine how displeased Maomao must be. Grand Marshal Lo then Basin said, not everyone could hope to simply sit down for a chat with the Grand Marshal, but Jinchi was the imperial younger brother. Basin assumed that would be enough to get him into the Grand Marshal's door. However, it wouldn't be that easy. Have you forgotten where Sir Lo's allegiance lies? Jinchi said. Grand Marshal Lo held his position through a personal appointment from the reigning emperor. Why had the emperor been willing to make that appointment? Do you believe our mother, I mean the Empress Dowager, would ever permit it? The emperor was substantially older than Jinchi, but the same mother had given birth to both of them. The Empress Dowager first entered the rear palace as a servant. The former emperor then chose her to be one of his consorts. At that time, many in the rear palace wanted to end her life. All of the former emperor's siblings had died of disease. Because of this, everyone knew that her son, the one who would later become Jinchi's older brother, and the reigning emperor, would be crown prince. Many people tried to gain the Empress Dowager's favor, hoping to gain power for themselves. However, Lo had been her ally since her days as a palace woman, it was said. She was barely 10 years old, but she had become the emperor's favorite. Because of this, even though she was a palace woman, she was sometimes permitted to go outside the rear palace. She was always accompanied by a bodyguard, and that guard was frequently Lo. Jinchi wondered what Lo must have thought of this palace woman whose body was not yet fully developed enough to bear a child. She had had other guards, but he was the only one she had given such patronage to afterward. He had clearly earned her trust, and yet he must have felt some hesitation as well. He would not defy her orders, but she was just a very kind woman. The system of slavery had already been shrinking, but the Empress Dowager's influence loomed large in its final abolishment. In the rear palace, she extended her kindness to those who had been the former emperor's companions and could not leave. However, her goodness sometimes proved to be a weakness. She disliked war. She did not often discuss it openly, but she held considerable influence with the emperor and the Grand Marshal. Jinchi could speak with the emperor. He would understand. He had already approved of Jinchi's idea. However, even though he was the emperor, he was not an absolute ruler. That is why Jinchi's memorandum was stuck in limbo. If it never reached the emperor, he could not officially approve it. Perhaps he and Lo might have found some common ground if Jinchi had held some sort of military position. But Jinchi had spent years as a eunuch in the rear palace, performing only his ritual duties as the emperor's younger brother. This left people unsure how to deal with Jinchi. He had been given the rank of Grand Protector, but this was normally an honorary title. It was something awarded to people who were retiring from public life. Considering that Jinchi was the emperor's younger brother, some said he should have been made prime minister. He was young, but other good people also wanted that position, so the excitement died down. One might have thought an honorary title would mean only a little work. That would have been pleasant, but he found himself overwhelmed with papers. Each day was a race to finish everything. They appeared to think of him as someone who could do a little bit of everything. So much time wasted talking about unimportant details, Maomao interrupted, replacing their now lukewarm tea with fresh tea. Sister, politics depends on such delicate matters, Basin said. Delicate? That is hardly a word I would use to describe you, she said with a mocking tone. Basin's lip twisted, but even though he could be hot-tempered, he knew he wouldn't get the best of his sister. The main thing is you want them to accept your demands, Maomao said. If it were that simple, I wouldn't be losing so much sleep, Jinchi said. He was no happier than Basin about Maomao's interruption. She was only supposed to be an assistant. It wasn't her job to start lecturing about political matters. I'm not saying it is simple. I'm just saying possibilities arise if you keep yourself open to them. They weren't sure what she had in mind. She went over to Bayu's corner and disappeared behind his screen. They heard a series of exclamations. Sister, hey, you can't just argue. It seemed it wasn't only Basin who was cowed by Maomao. When she emerged, lo and behold, she was holding the notorious Go book. She hadn't needed to steal her brother's copy. There had been plenty of them right in Jinchi's desk drawer. "Do you recognize this?" she said, taking out a piece of paper tucked into the book. Jinchi thought for a moment it was the book's promotional leaflet he had seen earlier. Then he realized it was something different. "A Go tournament?" "Yes," Maomao said. The paper announced it proudly. "I didn't see that in any of my copies," Jinchi said. Not in the ones Maomao had given him, or in the ones they had bought. "Did you purchase them yourself, Master Jinchi?" "No, I sent someone to do it for me." "Ah, perhaps they thought you would object then." Maomao pointed to the details of the tournament, which were outlined on the paper.